Most history books pinpoint the birth of the moving image to a specific year, 1895. That is when the Lumiere brothers held their first public film screening in Paris. We tend to view cinema entirely through the mechanics of the early camera, the hand crank, the celluloid strip, the glass lens. We equate the medium with the machine. But the human impulse to capture motion, time, and sequence is much older than the Industrial Revolution. It goes back tens of thousands of years. The true origin of cinematic storytelling relies on a cognitive breakthrough in how we perceive the world, not the invention of a piece of equipment. Deep in southern France lies the Pont d'Arc, a natural limestone bridge, marking a landscape unchanged since the last ice age, 32,000 years ago. Nearby is the Chauvet Cave. Prehistoric artists bypassed the smooth, flat sections of the rock walls. Instead, they deliberately sought out uneven, three-dimensional limestone contours to apply their charcoal. Look closely at the figures drawn here. The animals are drafted with multiple, overlapping legs. Rather than a mistake or a stylistic flourish, this repetitive drafting serves a specific structural function. When viewed by the light of a moving pine torch, the shadows cast by the rock's bulges begin to shift. The flickering orange light creates a natural strobe effect, and those overlapping lines blur into the illusion of literal motion. The animal appears to run. The artists at Chauvet engineered a way to manipulate light and shadow to project movement. This cave operated as an early immersive theater. We find an even earlier milestone 51,200 years ago, deep within the limestone caves of Sulawesi, Indonesia. Animating a single running animal is a study in motion. Connecting multiple figures into a cohesive, unfolding event requires a different kind of architectural thinking. On the cave wall in Sulawesi, we see a group of part human, part animal figures actively hunting a large pig. This is the earliest known record of an intentional narrative sequence. This diagram illustrates how the artist links disparate shapes across the rock using implied space. By connecting the sightlines of the hunters and mapping their physical distance from the prey, the painting creates a clear, directional flow of action. By staging a scene with hunters reacting to their target, these early humans stepped out of the role of passive observers. They were actively directing a multi-character event. As human settlements grew into complex empires, visual storytelling required a more rigid structure than the vast open canvas of a cave wall. The ancient Assyrians provided a clear solution. In their palace reliefs, Assyrians carved imagery into distinct architectural rows, organizing physical space into neat horizontal registers. These hard dividing lines forced the eye to read the stone in a specific, linear direction. They bounded the action, establishing the spatial limits of the frame. Constraining the image this way allowed the artist to dictate the pace of the story. Viewers follow the chronological passage of time by reading from one panel to the next, entirely without text. We see this executed in the Assyrian royal lion hunt. High-stakes action, chariot speeding, lions attacking, is contained logically and carried forward from one carved frame to the adjacent one. By taming the chaotic stone into sequential rows, the Assyrians established the editing structure that defines the modern film strip. If we look at the last 50,000 years of visual art, it reads less like a gallery of static objects and more like a continuous effort to project human reality onto a two-dimensional screen. There is a direct lineage from the flickering torchlight of Chauvet and the sequential storyboards of Assyria to the grammar used by modern filmmakers. The tools we associate with the cinema, framing, lighting, pacing, and sequence, are deeply rooted cognitive solutions to visual problems. The ancient painters and sculptors faced the immense challenge of capturing a dynamic, three-dimensional world on flat rock. In solving that problem, they became the original cinematographers. That primeval urge to manipulate perception only grew more sophisticated as centuries passed. During the Renaissance, the mathematical perfection of linear perspective gave flat surfaces infinite depth. The architecture in this fresco converges on a single vanishing point, functioning exactly like a wide-angle camera lens. By the Baroque era, painters discovered how to steer an audience's focus using extreme light contrast. In this painting, Caravaggio's mastery of chiaroscuro creates a stark, dramatic diagonal beam of light cutting through the dark room. This precise technique established the visual blueprint for the moody cinematography of film noir. Humanity has spent 50 millennia capturing light, time, and motion. We simply upgraded the projector. Every modern cinema camera operates on a hidden mathematical coordinate system designed to translate the world into a frame. But this visual grid wasn't a product of the industrial age. It was mapped out 6 centuries ago by painters. Art history is more than a gallery of static images. It is the record of humanity's first directors solving the mechanical problems of visual storytelling. For 50,000 years, artists struggled with a singular limitation: how to represent the 3-dimensional flow of life on a flat 2-dimensional surface. The earliest solutions were a form of proto-cinema. In deep caverns, the flickering of firelight across charcoal drawings created the illusion of animals in motion. The artists of the Chauvet cave deliberately overlapped heads and limbs to suggest a sequence of movement, the prehistoric equivalent of an animation cell. But by the Middle Ages, that sense of motion had stalled. Without a mathematical system to control depth, medieval art remained flat, with figures floating in space rather than occupying it. Because these creators couldn't yet control the geometry of the scene, they couldn't consistently guide the viewer's eye. It created a specific void in how space itself could be used to build a narrative. That void was filled in the early 15th century by Filippo Brunelleschi, who approached the canvas as the world's first cinematographer. He developed a breakthrough invention, the mathematical framework of linear perspective. By mapping the world toward a single vanishing point, Brunelleschi created a system projecting 3-dimensional reality onto a flat plane. This grid established the frame's rules, providing a formula for exactly how objects scale as they move into the distance. Brunelleschi didn't just invent a technique for drawing. He engineered the mathematical grid that modern camera lenses still use to organize and capture 3-dimensional reality. Following this breakthrough, painters like Leonardo da Vinci began executing what we now call a monoscenic narrative. Da Vinci's The Last Supper is a masterclass in engineering dramatic tension on a single, silent wall. He uses the room's architecture like invisible tracks, with ceiling and wall lines pulling the eye toward the center. Da Vinci blocks his actors into dynamic groups of 3, creating kinetic waves that contrast against the central, isolated figure of Jesus against the window. Da Vinci was using mathematical framing to control the human eye, creating psychological drama long before the invention of film. As the Renaissance progressed, Paolo Veronese scaled these techniques up to the level of a blockbuster producer. His work, The Wedding Feast at Cana, is a 750-square-foot panoramic spectacle. Veronese managed a cast of hundreds, placing musicians, nobles, and animals across the frame to create a massive, lived-in scale. He utilized sweeping classical architecture to build a world that completely immersed the viewer in the event. By scaling the cinematic grammar, these artists transformed flat walls into immersive spectacles centuries before the first movie studio. Today, the painter's canvas and the cinematographer's viewfinder are 2 parts of the same story. When we look through a modern viewfinder, we are seeing the final fusion of Renaissance geometry and digital optics, 2 technologies merging into a single system. The camera simply automated the spatial math that the Renaissance masters had painstakingly perfected by hand. This legacy is present every time we sit in the dark and look toward a screen. Art history isn't a record of the past, because every time we watch a film, we are still looking through Brunelleschi's lens. When we sit in a darkened theater, we surrender to an engineered illusion. The flickering screen dictates where we look, what we feel, and how we experience the passage of time. But the mechanical lens is a surprisingly recent invention. Before the mid-1800s, there was no glass and brass to automatically capture the world. For centuries, the Renaissance canvas represented the gold standard of reality. These works were built on mathematical precision, and perfectly balanced, uniform lighting, where every corner of the frame was treated with identical clarity. This total visibility resulted in a frozen, clinical arrangement that kept the viewer at a distance. Real life is nothing like a Renaissance painting. Human experience is chaotic, steeped in shadow, and moving at a relentless pace. This presented a massive technical hurdle. Artists had to figure out how to translate the depth, energy, and psychology of a three-dimensional world onto a flat, unmoving piece of fabric. To solve this, a handful of rebellious painters and sculptors had to hack the human visual system. Long before the first camera rolled, they engineered the techniques we now recognize as modern cinematography. By the late 1500s, the bright, even lighting of the Renaissance had become a trap. It displayed every detail with such perfection that it stripped scenes of their dramatic weight. The Italian painter Caravaggio broke this mold with a brute force architectural solution. He physically boarded up the windows of his studio, blacking out the room to eliminate all ambient light. This demonstrates his solution, chiaroscuro. Introducing a single lantern created an aggressive contrast between blinding white highlights and bottomless black shadow. Plunging the scene into darkness allowed Caravaggio to dictate exactly where the eye travels, hiding unnecessary details, framing only the vital action. The result is a sudden, shocking intimacy. The darkness isolates the subjects, creating an immediate sense of psychological tension and suspense. This technique became the defining visual grammar of film noir, using harsh geometry to project a character's internal dread onto the environment. Contemporary directors still rely on Caravaggio's blueprint. Sharp shadows carving across a face provide an instant signal of ambiguity, conflict, or danger. Caravaggio weaponized the light itself, effectively inventing the role of the modern lighting director. The 17th century Catholic Counter-Reformation required new visual propaganda to combat the rise of Protestantism. The Church demanded art designed to bypass the intellect and physically overwhelm the senses. A marble statue standing on a pedestal in the middle of a room failed this mission. The viewer could simply walk around it, remaining a detached observer. Sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini addressed this by carrying down the pedestal. In his masterpiece, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, he integrated the sculpture into the surrounding walls. He constructed the chapel as a multi-layered set, carving theater boxes for stone spectators. Bernini cut a concealed window behind the pediment to funnel sunlight onto the marble like a studio spotlight. This locks the audience into a forced perspective from a director-chosen vantage point. By building an immersive, three-dimensional narrative space, Bernini became history's first production designer. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution violently accelerated the pace of daily life. Humanity was suddenly moving at the speed of steam trains and mechanized ships. Traditional painting techniques struggled to capture this kinetic reality. A highly detailed, crisp rendering of a train freezes a single microsecond, making a fast-moving machine look static and lifeless. The British artist J.M.W. Turner realized that to convey speed, he had to abandon objective clarity. Instead of painting the exact shape of an object, he began painting the kinetic energy of the atmosphere around it. Look at the chaotic surface of his painting, The Slave Ship. The heavy, smeared brushstrokes prioritized the visceral feeling of motion over precise detail. By intentionally distorting the image, Turner found a way to trick the brain into feeling movement on a stationary surface, laying groundwork for motion blur. Modern action sequences utilize this exact logic. The background smears into horizontal streaks, mimicking how the human eye actually processes high-speed movement. Turner proved that capturing the intensity of speed requires sacrificing perfect focus, establishing a core rule of modern action direction. We experience modern cinema as a fully active, emotionally manipulative medium that bypasses our rational brain and hits us directly in the nervous system. That impact is the result of layered visual engineering, Caravaggio's psychological light, Bernini's forced perspective staging, and Turner's kinetic motion blur. The directors working today are speaking a visual language drafted on canvases and carved into marble centuries before the first reel of film was ever shot. Art history serves as a vibrant chronicle of active technological breakthroughs. It records a centuries-long effort by artists, desperate to hack the human eye and force static images to move and manipulate. As we sit in a dark theater today, we experience the blood-pumping culmination of this 500-year engineering project. For centuries, the ultimate ambition of the European painter was total, objective accuracy. The canvas was treated as a mathematical grid, where every line and shadow converged perfectly on a single vanishing point. When Filippo Brunelleschi codified linear perspective in the 15th century, he built the first camera lens out of geometry. A painting became a perfect window into a static, unchanging world, frozen from one exact location. Recording this objective reality was the painter's primary economic and cultural function. To record a battle, a portrait of a monarch, or a city layout, the painter was the only recording device available. Then, reality was captured in an instant. With the click of a shutter, a chaotic street scene could be perfectly frozen onto a silver-coated plate. A machine could now document the physical world faster and more accurately than any human hand. The recording device had been mechanized, leaving the traditional painter effectively obsolete. Claude Monet recognized that trying to compete with the camera was a losing battle. If the machine recorded the exact physical object, the human artist had to shift toward capturing the subjective, fleeting experience of seeing it. Monet abandoned the hard outlines of the Renaissance window. Instead, he painted the actual mechanics of human vision, the way light scatters through atmosphere before it hits the retina. By breaking the image down into raw color, he engineered the equivalent of cinematic soft focus, prioritizing atmosphere over precision. Paintings began to function as psychological mirrors. Artists projected their own moods directly onto the external landscape, using the physical world to represent internal emotional states. Impressionism was the deliberate invention of the subjective point of view. It was the crucial first crack in the objective, rigidly framed window of the Renaissance. The arrival of the 20th century brought rapid industrialization, global warfare, and a pace of urban life that felt increasingly fractured. A static point of view could no longer represent a reality defined by movement and the constant overlapping of new information. Pablo Picasso's solution was to dismantle the traditional camera frame entirely. He stopped treating the canvas as a window and used it as a surface where time and space could be manipulated. He forced the viewer to observe an object from multiple angles simultaneously. By locking a side profile and a frontal view together, the eye is forced to jump between perspectives to make sense of the subject. This mental jumping acts as a primitive edit. Long before motion pictures perfected the jump cut, cubists were using the canvas to rapidly cross-cut through space without ever moving the canvas. In the United States, the Great Migration saw millions of African Americans move from the rural South to the urban North. It was a sociological epic, far too massive to fit inside a single geometric frame. To document this mass movement, the painter Jacob Lawrence chose to fracture chronological time rather than spatial geometry. Lawrence structured his migration series across 60 distinct sequential panels, meant to be read one after the other. He utilized repeating flat forms and a rhythmic, consistent color palette to pull the viewer's eye forward through the sequence, driving the narrative across years and geography. Lawrence's series functions as a master cinematic storyboard. It proves that painting could achieve the pacing, rhythm, and temporal scope of a feature film long before the viewer ever sat down in a theater. Eventually, artists realized that a framed canvas hanging quietly on a gallery wall was entirely too restrictive for a rapidly expanding public audience. They sought to break the physical borders of the painting entirely and physically surround the viewer inside the art itself. The Detroit Institute of Arts became the staging ground for this shift, providing massive interior walls for a new visual language. The Mexican muralists, including Diego Rivera, reconfigured these architectural spaces into narrative environments, engineering sweeping visual stories specifically designed for the working class. These murals functioned like early IMAX theaters. They physically wrapped overlapping narratives of heavy industry, agriculture, and human labor completely around the audience. You cannot take in a wraparound mural from a single static vantage point. The audience is forced to walk, turn their heads, and move their bodies, editing the story together in real time as they navigate the room. This desire for wraparound immersion is actually the oldest artistic instinct humans possess, dating back tens of thousands of years. Deep underground, ancient cave walls functioned as the original immersive screens. The natural contours of Baroque, illuminated by flickering firelight, created the illusion of motion, a form of proto-cinema long before the wheel was even invented. Today, that same ancient drive fuels contemporary, multi-sensory digital installations. The human desire for total sensory immersion is a permanent constant. The history of modern art traces a relentless rebellion against the static image. Each movement shattered the single frame to build the immersive language required to truly step inside the human story.